Hello students. I am Gyan from English Magus. Welcome to our video lesson, The Address Chapter 2 from Snapshots. Today, we embark on an emotional journey as we explore the painful tale of a daughter returning to her mother's home in Holland after the war. This address she follows is more than just a place, it's a repository of memories, loss, and resilience. Let's dive in. Before we take up the chapter, let's get familiarized with the author a bit. Marga Minco, born in 1920, was a Dutch journalist and writer. She survived the Holocaust, losing her entire family to the Nazi regime. Her touching accounts of wartime experiences and the aftermath are characterized by a sober and restrained style. She passed away in 2023. Before I start explaining the text, here is a short overview of the chapter to help you grasp its theme. This short story is an emotional account of a daughter who goes in search of her mother's belongings after the war, in Holland. When she finds them, the objects evoke memories of her earlier life. However, she decides to leave them all behind and resolves to move on. Before I start explaining the lesson, I would like to recommend to pause the video at each slide and read the text, and then listen to the explanation. It will give you better results. In these lines we see, the narrator goes to meet a woman who once knew her mother, who had given her belongings to her before going to a hiding place. Kindly note, Mrs. S is the name of the narrator's mother. The tension builds as the woman hesitates, denying recognition. The daughter's hopeful revelation is met with silence, leaving her uncertain. The scene captures the pain of lost connections and the haunting impact of time and war. In these lines, the narrator tells the readers that the woman whom she had gone to meet was wearing her late mother's green knitted cardigan. The faded wooden buttons hint at years of use and washing. The woman's evasive behavior, half hiding behind the door, adds to the mystery. When the narrator confirms her identity, the woman expresses surprise that she has returned. The musty smell from the passage evokes memories and sets the scene for their emotional reunion. In this scene, the woman tells the narrator she can't help her and closes the door, making sure not to disturb anyone inside. The visitor feels ignored and sees someone peek through the window, curious about her presence. The woman inside dismisses the visitor's importance, suggesting to the person at the window that it was nothing significant. The narrator is hurt as the woman had intentionally ignored her and shown hesitation in recognizing her. Maybe she did not want to return her mother's belongings to her. She started going away from that house. The narrator looked at the nameplate again. It said, Darling, in black letters on white enamel. The house number was 46. As she walked back to the station, she thought about the past, her mother, who had given her this address during the early part of the war. When she had visited home briefly, she noticed things were missing. Her mother then had told her about Mrs. Darling. While going to the station, she is still thinking about the past. She had never heard of Mrs. Darling before, but apparently, she was an old acquaintance of her mother, whom her mother hadn't seen for years. Mrs. Darling had suddenly reappeared and renewed their contact. Since then, she had come regularly. She took all the table silver at once. Then the antique plates that hung there. She had trouble carrying those large vases, and the narrator's mother was worried she might hurt her back with the heavy weight of crockery. Her mother was surprised that Mrs. Darling had insisted on taking care of their belongings in case they had to flee to safety. The narrator is still thinking the past in these lines. She wanted to save my nice things because the narrator and her mother might have to leave, and Mrs. Darling said she wanted to save their things and belongings. The narrator asked her mother if she had agreed that Mrs. Darling should keep everything. Her mother responded that there was no need for an agreement, as discussing it would be an insult. She added that Mrs. Darling took a risk every time she left with a full suitcase. Seeing her daughter wasn't convinced, her mother gave her a disapproving look, and they didn't talk about it again. These lines mean thinking about the past. The narrator reached the station without paying much attention to her surroundings. It was her first time walking in these familiar places since the war, but she didn't want to go further and upset herself with memories of the past. On the train back, she had a flashback and remembered the first time she saw Mrs. Darling. It was the morning after her mother had told her about Mrs. Darling. She had come downstairs late and saw her mother about to see someone out. The woman had brought back. Her mother introduced her, saying, There is my daughter, and motioned for her to come over. The woman nodded and picked up a suitcase from under the coat rack. She wore a brown coat and a shapeless hat. Noticing the woman's struggle with the heavy suitcase, she asked if the woman lived far away. Her mother replied that she lived on Marconi Street, number 46, and told her to remember it. She had remembered but waited a long time to visit. After the liberation, she wasn't interested in the stored items and was somewhat afraid of them. She was afraid of facing items that belonged to a connection that no longer existed, stored away in cupboards and boxes, waiting to be returned to their place. Gradually, things started to feel more normal. Bread became lighter, beds felt safer, and the view from the room became familiar. Eventually, she became curious about the possessions at the address and wanted to see, touch, and remember them. After her first unsuccessful visit to Mrs. Dawling's house, she decided to try again. This time, a teenage girl answered the door and said her mother was out running an errand. Undeterred, she decided to wait. As she followed the girl inside, she noticed an old-fashioned iron Hanukkah candle holder hanging next to a mirror, which they never used because it was more cumbersome than a single candlestick. Here cumbersome means heavy and difficult to use. The girl invited her to sit down in the living room, holding the door open for her. As she entered, she felt horrified. Although she recognized the room, it felt unfamiliar. She found herself surrounded by things she wanted to see again but felt oppressed by the strange atmosphere, tasteless arrangement, ugly furniture, and muggy smell. The girl moved a chair, and she sat down, staring at the woolen tablecloth, feeling her fingers grow warm from rubbing it. She followed the pattern's lines, looking for an unrepaired burn mark. The girl said her mother would return soon and offered her tea, which she accepted. As the girl prepared tea, she noticed her broad back, similar to her mother's. She poured tea from a white pot with a gold border. She admired a box and commented on it. The girl laughed, saying her mother called it antique, and gestured around the room to show there were more similar items. She remarked that one only noticed when something was missing, either because it needed repair or because it had been lent out. She remembered her mother once asking her to help polish the silver, which surprised her as it was the first time her mother had asked. She asked which silver her mother meant, and her mother replied, surprised, that it was the spoons, forks, and knives, of course. She found it strange not knowing the everyday cutlery was silver. The girl laughed, saying she probably didn't know either. When the girl asked if she knew what they ate with, she hesitated. The girl went to check a drawer, but she abruptly said she had to catch her train and walked to the door, declining to wait for the girl's mother. The girl opened the drawer as she walked down the passage. She heard the sound of spoons and forks jingling. At the corner of the road, she glanced up at the nameplate, confirming she had been at number 46 on Marconi Street. Though the address was correct, she didn't want to remember it anymore. She decided not to go back because objects linked to familiar memories instantly lose their value when seen in unfamiliar surroundings. She questioned what she would do with the cutlery in her small rented room, where remnants of blackout paper still covered the windows and only a handful of cutlery fit in the narrow table drawer. She decided to forget the address, considering it the easiest thing to forget among all the things she needed to erase from her memory. With this, the chapter ends. Here is the list of figures of speech used in the chapter. Pause the video and read it. Kindly like, share and subscribe if you found the video lesson helpful. Thanks for watching the video.